Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. As the Book of Deuteronomy draws to a close, it also brings an end to the leadership of Moses. But God had more in store for Moses than simply turning over the reins of leadership to Joshua. He was going to give up far more than his role as deliverer of Israel. Moses wouldn't have the option of retiring from office and fading into the background as one of the millions of Israelites who crossed the Jordan into Canaan. God was going to ban him from ever setting foot in the land, and instead would ensure that the wilderness would be his final destination. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 48 through 52, God once again reminds Moses of the painful consequences for his earlier indiscretion. Moses had treated God with disrespect, and was now going to pay the ultimate penalty for his sin. Failing to treat God as holy would cost him, and his life would be an example to the people of Israel. That very day the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go up this mountain of the Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, opposite Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel for a possession. And die on the mountain which you go up, and be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother died in Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people, because you broke faith with me in the midst of the people of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, and because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel. For you shall see the land before you, but you shall not go there, into the land that I am giving to the people of Israel." Deuteronomy 32, verses 48 through 52. That very day. Those three simple words are filled with significance. The same day on which Moses delivered the words of God's song to the people of Israel would be his last. Not only would he be denied entrance into the land of Canaan, but he would exit this life for the next one. Moses is informed by God that he will die alone on a mountaintop somewhere on the eastern side of the Jordan. The phrase, "close but no cigar," comes to mind. Moses was close enough to see the land, but would never have the joy of crossing over the Jordan or enjoying the fruit of all his labors. From the moment God had called him to deliver Israel from their captivity in Egypt, Moses had lived with one objective in mind: to lead God's people to the land he had promised as their inheritance. When God had appeared to Moses all those years earlier, it had been on another mountaintop, at Horeb, and God had shown up in the form of a burning bush. On that occasion, God had delivered the news to Moses that he had plans for his people. "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Exodus 3, verses 7 through 8. Fast forward, and that's exactly where we find Moses, standing on the edge of a land flowing with milk and honey. Moses could see it with his own eyes. He could look on it longingly, but he would never set foot there, all because he had sinned against God. And it's a bit ironic that Moses has just spent a great deal of time addressing the people of God about the need to keep God's law faithfully and to treat God himself reverently. He has gone out of his way to stress the seriousness of sin and the danger of disobedience. In a way, Moses had been speaking from personal experience. He knew firsthand what happens when you fail to do God's will on God's terms. There was no room for improvisation. God was not interested in seeing their version of his will. He had not asked for their input or allowed them the option of extemporizing on his commands. But that's exactly what Moses had done. God accuses Moses of breaking faith with him and of failing to treat him as holy. But what had he done? What was the crime Moses committed that kept him from entering the land of promise? The story is recorded in Numbers chapter 20, and it began with the people of God complaining about their lack of water. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place?" Numbers 20, verses 2 through 5. They were not happy campers. They were thirsty and they were upset. So Moses took their complaint to God, who provided Moses with very specific instructions. Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. Numbers 20, verse 8. But what did Moses do? How did he end up enacting the instructions given to him by God? The text is very explicit. Moses and Aaron gathered all the people together and prepared to do what God had told them to do, but with a slight twist. Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. Numbers 20, verses 10 through 11. You can almost hear the anger in his voice. He's put out with the people of Israel. This was not the first time he had been confronted with their anger and resentment, and it had only been a short time since his sister Miriam had died. He had not even had time to grieve over his loss, and now he was having to deal with these ungrateful, grumbling ingrates again. So he took advantage of the God-given opportunity to put on a show for the people. He struck the rock with the staff, not once, but twice. Not exactly what God had told him to do, but his act of anger-induced spontaneity seemed to have produced the same results. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. But he had not done God's will God's way. And God accused Moses of breaking faith and treating him as unholy. He had let his anger get the best of him, and in doing so he displayed his lack of faith in God. It's almost as if Moses doubted that God was going to do what he had promised to do. Look closely at the words Moses spoke before striking the rock. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Notice the emphasis on himself and Aaron, not God. And there is a degree of uncertainty or doubt in his voice as he states, shall we? Perhaps Moses was questioning the ability of God to bring water out of a rock. He seems to be having misgivings about God's plan. So rather than speak to the rock as God had commanded, he decided to use the staff to strike the rock. He took out his anger on the rock. And the Apostle Paul would later describe that rock as being a symbol or representation of Jesus himself. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 3. Moses struck the rock, and in doing so he displayed a lack of faith in God and demonstrated a disdain for the holiness of God. That rock was to have been a symbol of God's gracious provision. There was no need to beat God into caring for their needs. God did not require coercion or compulsion. But because Moses did what he did, he was denied access to the land of promise. His sin was no different than the generation of Israelites who had refused to enter Canaan due to their fear of giants in the land. They doubted God and trusted the words of men, and they all died in the wilderness. Because Moses had failed to treat God as holy, he would fail to enter the land of promise. God is holy, and he demands that those who bear his name live their lives in such a way that his reputation is honored by their actions. Moses had been God's shepherd over the nation of Israel. He was God's hand-picked leader, and all that he said and did reflected on the character of God. He was held to a higher standard. He was obligated to live according to God's will faithfully and to speak God's word accurately. And because he didn't, he was denied access into the land of promise. For you shall see the land before you, but you shall not go there, into the land that I am giving to the people of Israel. Deuteronomy 32, verse 52.